In the year 2020, in the city that would one day become the most unlikely survivor of nuclear apocalypse, a child was born who would outlive the world itself. His name was Robert Edwin House, and he was born into wealth, privilege, and a family that gave him access to the resources that would eventually allow him to do the impossible: save Las Vegas from nuclear annihilation and rule it for over 2 centuries. This is the story of New Vegas. But before there was New Vegas, before the neon and the Securitrons and the casinos rebuilt from atomic ruins, there was simply Vegas. And before Vegas became the jewel of the Mojave Wasteland, there was a man with a vision, a fortune, and an almost superhuman confidence in his own ability to predict and control the future. Robert House was born to the H&H Tools family, one of Las Vegas's wealthiest and most established dynasties. The House family had made their fortune in manufacturing and industry, building the kind of generational wealth that opened doors others couldn't even see. Young Robert had the best education money could buy, access to the finest minds of his generation, and, perhaps most importantly, the expectation that he would not merely inherit wealth, but expand it, transform it, use it to reshape the world according to his vision. And Robert House had vision in abundance. Even as a young man, he demonstrated an intellect that went beyond mere intelligence into something approaching genius. He understood mathematics, engineering, computer science, economics. All of it came naturally to him in ways that frustrated and amazed his teachers. But more than raw intellectual capacity, House had something rarer: the ability to see patterns in chaos, to predict future developments from present trends, to calculate probabilities that others couldn't even conceptualize. By mid-century, House had transformed his inheritance into an empire. He founded Robco Industries, a technology and robotics corporation that would become one of the most powerful industrial entities in pre-war America. Robco competed directly with General Atomics International and other giants, producing everything from personal computers to advanced robotics to weapon systems for the US military. But Robco's most significant innovation was the Securitron, a security and combat robot that combined mobility, artificial intelligence, and impressive firepower in a package that could serve both civilian and military applications. The Securitron would become House's signature creation, the tool through which he would eventually reclaim Las Vegas and enforce his will across the Mojave. But in these pre-war years, they were simply another successful Robco product, sold to corporations and governments that valued automated security. House's success made him obscenely wealthy, even by the standards of America's industrial elite. He could have purchased mansions, yachts, private islands, all the typical displays of wealth that his peers indulged in. Instead, House made a different choice. He purchased the Lucky 38 casino on the Las Vegas Strip. The Lucky 38 was not just a casino. It was one of the Strip's most prominent landmarks, a towering structure topped with a massive Lucky 38 logo visible for miles. But House didn't buy it for the gambling revenue or the prestige. He bought it because he saw what Las Vegas could become, and he wanted to be positioned at its absolute center when that future arrived. House moved his primary operations into the Lucky 38, converting the upper floors into a combination of personal residence, corporate headquarters, and something more: a fortress, a command center, a facility from which he could monitor and control not just his business empire, but the city itself. He installed cutting-edge computer systems, surveillance networks, communication arrays. The Lucky 38 became less a casino and more a technological nerve center, disguised as a gambling establishment. And then, in the 2070s, House's predictive capabilities led him to a conclusion that would define everything that followed. Nuclear war was inevitable, and it was coming soon. This wasn't paranoia or doomsaying. House had access to intelligence that most private citizens never saw. He understood the trajectory of the resource wars, the escalating tensions between the United States and China, the desperate scramble for remaining oil and uranium deposits. He calculated probabilities, ran simulations, analyzed trends, and every model, every projection, every careful extrapolation pointed to the same conclusion. The missiles were going to fly, probably within the next few years, and when they did, civilization as it existed would end. Most people, confronted with such a prediction, would have despaired or simply tried to enjoy what time remained. House, characteristically, saw an opportunity. If nuclear war was inevitable, and if he could survive it, then the post-war world would be a blank slate, a chance to build something new, something better, something under his control. All he had to do was ensure that he and Las Vegas survived the bombs. So, House built a defense network. Not a shelter, not a bunker where he would hide and hope, but an active defense system designed to protect Las Vegas from nuclear strike. It was an audacious plan, something that most would have dismissed as impossible. But House had the resources of Robco Industries, access to advanced technology, and the kind of focused determination that made the improbable merely difficult. The system centered on the Lucky 38. House installed laser defense platforms on the roof and surrounding buildings, designed to track and shoot down incoming missiles. He established ground-based defense positions throughout the city, creating overlapping fields of fire that could intercept warheads before they reached critical infrastructure. He even secured access to orbital defense platforms, though whether through purchase, theft, or some arrangement with military contacts remains unclear in the historical record. But the defense network was only part of House's preparation. He also had to ensure his own survival, not just through the immediate nuclear exchange, but for decades or potentially centuries afterward. The post-war world, he calculated, would take time to stabilize. There would be a period of chaos, of societal collapse, of survivors struggling simply to stay alive. House needed to outlast that chaos, to remain preserved and capable until the moment came when he could emerge and begin rebuilding civilization, his civilization, in the Mojave. So House constructed a life support system unlike anything else in the pre-war world. It was more than a simple stasis pod. It was a complete integration of his body with a computerized life support network, maintaining his biological functions while allowing his mind to interface directly with the Lucky 38 systems. House would be, in effect, part of the building itself, a human brain serving as the central processing unit for a massive computer network, able to perceive through cameras and sensors, to communicate through speakers and terminals, to act through Securitrons and other robotic systems. The life support pod was an engineering marvel, but it was also a prison. Once House entered it, he would never leave. His body would be sustained indefinitely, but he would exist only as a consciousness within a machine, experiencing the world through electronic intermediaries, forever separated from direct physical experience. It was a sacrifice of everything that made life worth living: sensation, movement, the simple pleasure of walking in sunlight or feeling rain. But House made that sacrifice willingly, even eagerly, because in exchange he would have something no human had ever possessed: effective immortality and absolute control over his domain. He would outlive his enemies, outlast his rivals, remain conscious and capable while the world aged and changed around him. And when the time was right, he would emerge not as a survivor, but as the architect of a new civilization, built according to his specifications, run by his rules, existing solely to fulfill his vision. In the final months before October 2077, House completed his preparations. The defense network was operational. The life support pod was ready. His Securitrons were manufactured and deployed, waiting in underground storage for the moment when they would be needed. The Lucky 38 systems were armed and active, its cameras and sensors monitoring the skies for the missiles that House's calculations insisted were coming. House stood at the pinnacle of pre-war achievement, one of America's richest men, a technological genius, the master of Las Vegas, with resources and capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. He had everything except time. The war was coming. His predictions were clear on that point. All he could do was wait, watch, and hope that his preparations would be sufficient. On October 23, 2077, at 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Robert House's predictions proved correct. NORAD detected launches from China. The United States responded in kind. And within minutes, the nuclear exchange that would destroy civilization began. House, sealed within his pod in the Lucky 38, watched through his defense network as the missiles arced across the sky. Dozens of warheads targeted Las Vegas, the city's casinos, its military installations, its infrastructure. Any one of them would have been sufficient to reduce the strip to radioactive glass. Together, they represented complete annihilation. House's defense system engaged. Lasers tracked the incoming missiles. Calculations were made in microseconds. Firing solutions were computed. And one by one, the warheads were destroyed or diverted. Not all of them. House's system was sophisticated, but not perfect. Some missiles got through, detonating in the outskirts of Las Vegas, in the surrounding desert, close enough that the shockwaves and electromagnetic pulses disrupted systems and caused damage throughout the city. But the strip itself, the core of Las Vegas that House had worked so hard to preserve, survived largely intact. When the fire and chaos subsided, when the mushroom clouds rose over the distant ruins of what had been American cities, Las Vegas still stood. Damaged, yes. Its power grid was compromised. Many buildings were destroyed or heavily damaged. The surrounding area had been devastated by the warheads that House's system hadn't intercepted. But the casinos remained. The Lucky 38 remained. And House himself, sealed in his life support pod, remained. He had saved Las Vegas from nuclear annihilation. He had proven his predictions correct and his preparations sufficient. He had won the first gamble of the post-war world, a bet that he could survive the apocalypse and preserve the city he intended to rule. But that victory came with an unexpected cost. The strain of operating the defense network, the damage from near misses and electromagnetic pulses, the shock of watching the world end while fighting to prevent his city's destruction. Something went wrong with House's life support systems. Not catastrophically wrong, not fatally wrong, but wrong enough. Robert House, the man who had calculated every variable and prepared for every contingency, fell into a coma. Not death, but a deep unconsciousness from which he would not emerge for over 60 years. His body remained alive, sustained by the pod. His brain remained intact, preserved by the life support systems. But his consciousness, the brilliant mind that had predicted and survived the apocalypse, was simply absent. The lucky 38 sealed itself. Automated systems took over, maintaining House's body, monitoring the city, but taking no active role in the post-war chaos that engulfed the Mojave. The defense network went dormant. The Securitrons remained in storage. And Las Vegas, having survived the nuclear fire, began its long descent into the wasteland. Outside the sealed tower, the world had changed. The Mojave Desert, already harsh, became a nightmare of radiation and twisted life. Survivors emerged from shelters and buildings that had weathered the blasts, finding themselves in a landscape they barely recognized. The infrastructure that had sustained millions had collapsed. The government was gone. The old rules no longer applied. And in the lucky 38, Robert House slept, his dreams unknown, while the city he had saved began its transformation into something he had never predicted, something that would take generations to evolve into the new Vegas he would eventually claim. The immediate aftermath of the Great War was chaos in its purest form. The nuclear exchange had lasted only hours, but its effects would shape the world for centuries. Every major city had been targeted. Every piece of infrastructure that held civilization together had been destroyed or rendered useless. The electromagnetic pulses had fried electronics across continents, and in the ruins, survivors faced the grim reality that the world they had known was simply gone. But Las Vegas, thanks to House's defense network, was different. The city had taken damage, certainly. The outskirts were devastated, reduced to radioactive rubble by the missiles that had gotten through House's defenses. Buildings throughout the city had been damaged by shockwaves and fires. The power grid had failed, plunging the strip into darkness. But the core structures remained. The casinos still stood, the distinctive architecture marking them as monuments to a dead civilization. And most importantly, they were largely intact, not just shells, but actual buildings that could provide shelter, that retained some of their pre-war equipment and infrastructure. This made Las Vegas one of the least destroyed major cities in post-war America. While Washington, D.C. was a crater, while Los Angeles was buried under radioactive ash, while countless other population centers had been reduced to glowing ruins, Las Vegas stood, damaged but standing, empty but intact, waiting. The Mojave Desert that surrounded the city had always been harsh. Now it became lethal. Radiation contaminated water sources. The ecosystem collapsed and reformed into something twisted and dangerous. Creatures mutated, adapted, or died. The temperature extremes that had made pre-war Mojave challenging became life-threatening in the absence of air conditioning, protective shelter, and medical care. But survivors adapted, as humans always do. Small groups emerged from basements and shelters, from buildings that had provided enough protection to keep them alive through the initial blasts. They scavenged for food, water, supplies. They fought over resources. They formed temporary alliances that dissolved when the immediate crisis passed. Some headed into the wasteland, seeking other survivors or better conditions. Others stayed in the ruins of Las Vegas, claiming territories among the broken buildings. In these early years, the Strip was just one neighborhood among many, more intact than most, certainly, but also more exposed, with less cover from radiation and less accessible water sources. The real action was in the suburbs and outer districts where survivors could find water, grow food in contaminated soil, establish some semblance of stable communities. The casinos sat empty. These massive structures, built to house thousands of guests and extract their money through gambling and entertainment, had no purpose in a world without money, without electricity, without the infrastructure that made them functional. They were just buildings now, albeit impressive ones. Survivors occasionally explored them, looking for supplies or shelter, but found little of value. The food had long since spoiled. The water systems didn't function. The slot machines and gaming tables were useless without power or currency. And the Lucky 38, that tallest tower on the Strip, remained sealed. Automated defenses kept everyone out. Cameras and sensors monitored the approaches, though no one watching them could have known that no one was actually watching. Anyone who tried to force entry found themselves facing security measures that still functioned when most pre-war technology had failed. After a few costly attempts, survivors learned to avoid the Lucky 38, which earned a reputation as cursed or haunted. Inside that sealed tower, Robert House remained in his coma, his body sustained by systems designed to outlast civilizations. The Lucky 38's mainframe continued its operations, maintaining life support, monitoring systems, waiting for the consciousness it served to return. The facility was tomb and womb simultaneously, preserving House's body while waiting for his rebirth into the post-war world. Decades passed. The immediate survivors of the Great War died, succeeded by their children who had been born into the wasteland and knew nothing else. These second-generation survivors began forming more stable communities, establishing trade routes, developing cultural identities that went beyond simple survival. The Mojave Wasteland began to organize itself into a patchwork of settlements and territories. Some of these groups moved on to the Strip. The intact casinos, once they were understood as simply buildings, rather than magical or cursed sites, became attractive real estate. Large, defensible, with existing walls and infrastructure that could be adapted to wasteland needs. Different groups claimed different casinos, fortifying them, turning gambling floors into living quarters, converting kitchens into workshops, transforming entertainment venues into something resembling fortified villages. These groups called themselves tribes, and they developed distinct identities around their casino homes. Some maintained elements of pre-war Vegas culture that they found in recordings or decorations, creating cargo cult versions of entertainment and hospitality. Others developed entirely new traditions, based on the martial culture necessary for wasteland survival. They fought each other for territory and resources, formed temporary alliances, raided caravans that tried to cross their lands. The Strip became tribal territory, divided among various groups that rose and fell over the decades. Weak tribes were absorbed or destroyed, Strong tribes expanded their holdings. Leadership changed through combat or assassination. It was a harsh, violent existence, but it was existence nonetheless. Humans making homes in the ruins of the old world, adapting to post-war reality in the shadow of dark casinos. Around the Strip, the broader Mojave developed its own character. Freeside, the neighborhood surrounding the Strip, became a buffer zone. Less organized than the Strip tribes, more chaotic, but also more accessible to travelers and traders. Various settlements sprang up along what had been major highways, clustering around water sources or resource deposits. Tribes formed, dissolved, reformed. Raiders preyed on the weak. Merchants braved the dangers to trade between communities. And still, the lucky 38 remained sealed, House sleeping within it, unaware of what his city had become. His Securitrons remained in storage beneath the Strip and at other locations he had designated, waiting for activation signals that didn't come. His defense network sat dormant, its weapons aimed at skies that no longer held threats. The elaborate systems he had built to ensure his control over Las Vegas continued their maintenance cycles, preserving capability without purpose. In 2138, 61 years after the Great War, something changed. The exact trigger remains unknown. Perhaps a scheduled subroutine finally completing, perhaps a system repair reaching critical threshold, perhaps simply time and automated recovery protocols. But whatever the cause, Robert House woke up. The return to consciousness was not sudden. House didn't simply open his eyes. He had no eyes anymore, not in any functional sense. Instead, awareness gradually returned as his neural interface reconnected with the Lucky 38 systems. He became aware first of basic sensory input, temperature readings, power levels, system diagnostics. Then higher functions came online: memory, reasoning, the complex cognitive processes that made him who he was. House reviewed his systems, assessed his status, and began to understand what had happened. The Great War had occurred as he predicted. His defense network had functioned, saving Las Vegas from complete destruction. But he had lost decades, sleeping through the immediate post-war period that he had meant to witness and control. The city he had saved had evolved without his guidance, become something other than what he had planned. His first instinct might have been to immediately assert control, to activate his Securitrons and reclaim the Strip. But House was nothing if not careful. He had made a mistake once, had something go wrong with his preparations that cost him 6 decades. He would not make another mistake by acting precipitously now. So, House watched. Through cameras and sensors that had operated autonomously throughout his sleep, he observed the Strip, the tribes that occupied his casinos, the wasteland that surrounded his city. He monitored radio communications, studied tribal movements and conflicts, analyzed the post-war economy such as it existed. He gathered data, built models, calculated probabilities, and he planned. Because House understood something that would take others decades to learn. The wasteland wasn't permanent. This chaos, this tribal savagery, this collapse of civilization, it was temporary. Humanity would rebuild. Organizations would form. Something approximating society would emerge from the ruins. And when that happened, whoever controlled Las Vegas, whoever held the center of the Mojave, would be positioned to shape that emerging order. House had saved Las Vegas for a reason. Not out of sentimentality or civic pride, but because he understood that controlling Vegas meant controlling the crossroads of the Mojave, the gateway between California and the East, the city that had once drawn millions of visitors and could do so again. The Strip wasn't just buildings and neon, it was position, it was infrastructure, it was potential. But that potential couldn't be realized immediately. House was awake, but he was also alone, sealed in his tower with only automated systems to serve him. His Securitrons were in storage. His wealth was worthless in a world without functioning economy. His authority was non-existent to tribes that had never heard of Robco Industries and wouldn't care if they had. So House waited. For decades more, he remained hidden in the Lucky 38, watching the wasteland evolve, studying the patterns of tribal conflict and alliance, monitoring developments beyond the Mojave. He was gathering information, yes, but also waiting for the right moment, the moment when he could act decisively, when the pieces would be in place for him to reclaim his city and implement his vision. That moment would come, but not yet. For now, in the mid-22nd century, House was a ghost in his own city, a consciousness sealed in a tower, watching raiders and tribals fight over casinos he had once owned, waiting for his chance to remind the wasteland who had saved Las Vegas, and who would rule it again. The tribes didn't know they were being watched. They didn't know that every conflict, every alliance, every decision they made was being recorded and analyzed by a pre-war intelligence that was calculating how to use them, control them, or eliminate them when the time came. And outside the Mojave, forces were gathering that would eventually force House's hand. The new California Republic was forming on the West Coast, growing from scattered settlements into something resembling government. Brotherhood of Steel chapters were establishing themselves across the wasteland. Raiders were consolidating into larger, more dangerous organizations. The post-war world was organizing itself, and Las Vegas, sitting at the crossroads, would inevitably become a prize that multiple factions would seek to claim. House understood this. His calculations had predicted it. And when those factions came, when the NCR or the Brotherhood or whoever else thought they could simply take Vegas, they would discover that the city already had an owner who had been preparing for their arrival, who understood them better than they understood themselves, who held advantages they couldn't counter. The house always wins. That had been the motto of pre-war casinos, the promise that kept gamblers coming back even as they lost their money. House intended to make it literal. The house, his house, the Lucky 38 New Vegas, Robert Edwin House himself, would always win because he controlled the game, set the rules, and had been planning his moves since before the other players were even born. But first, he needed to wait just a little longer, to let the pieces move into position, to choose his moment with the same careful calculation that had let him save Las Vegas from nuclear fire. The wasteland thought Las Vegas was dead, waiting to be claimed by whoever proved strongest. They were wrong. Las Vegas had an owner. It always had. And soon, very soon in historical terms, Robert House would remind everyone of that fact. Among the many preparations House had made before the Great War, one stood out as particularly crucial: the platinum chip. It was a data storage device, unique and irreplaceable, containing the final upgrade for House's Securitron network. The upgrade would transform his robots from capable security units into devastating military forces, equipped with advanced weapon systems and tactical algorithms that would make them superior to most post-war military hardware. The chip had been manufactured and was being delivered to the Lucky 38 when the bombs fell. Somewhere in the chaos of October 23, 2077, the courier carrying it had died or abandoned the delivery. The chip was lost somewhere in the wasteland, while House slept through the decades that followed. When House awoke in 2138, one of his first priorities was locating the platinum chip. His systems could track it through its unique electronic signature, but the signal was faint, intermittent, obscured by the electromagnetic interference that still plagued the post-war world. House knew the chip existed somewhere in the Mojave, but pinpointing its exact location would take time and resources he didn't yet have. Without the chip, House's Securitrons remained in their original configuration, intimidating but not overwhelming, capable of maintaining order but not of projecting serious military power. With the chip, they would become an army that could rival the Brotherhood of Steel or any other major faction. The difference between having and not having the platinum chip was the difference between running a well-defended casino city and controlling a military powerhouse. So the search for the chip became one of House's long-term projects, running in parallel with his other plans. He monitored scavengers and traders, tracked rumors of pre-war artifacts, maintained careful surveillance of anyone who might have stumbled across it. And he waited, because House was nothing if not patient. While House plotted in his tower, the broader wasteland was evolving in ways that would ultimately force his hand. To the west, in California, something remarkable was happening. Actual government was being reborn. The new California Republic formed from an alliance of settlements and communities, established laws and elections, began expanding its territory and influence. By the late 20-teens, the NCR had become a genuine nation-state, the most powerful and organized faction in the post-war American West. The NCR's expansion was driven partly by idealism, a genuine desire to restore civilization and democratic governance, but also by practical necessity. They needed resources, food, water, weapons, territory. They needed to expand to survive, to grow their population and economy. And their expansion inevitably brought them east, toward Nevada, toward the Mojave Desert, and the prizes it contained. The greatest of those prizes was Hoover Dam. The massive pre-war hydroelectric facility had survived the Great War remarkably intact, its position in a protected canyon having shielded it from the worst effects. The dam still held back the Colorado River. Its generators, though inactive, remained largely functional. If it could be restored, Hoover Dam could provide electricity for the entire region, power for cities, for industries, for the infrastructure necessary to rebuild civilization. The NCR had engineers, resources, and motivation. Restoring Hoover Dam became a priority for the Republic, a project that would demonstrate their capabilities and provide the power needed for further expansion. NCR expeditions began reaching Nevada in the 2020s, scouting routes, establishing forward positions, preparing for the major effort that would be required to claim and repair the dam. These expeditions also brought back reports of Las Vegas, the relatively intact Strip, the mysterious Lucky 38, the tribal occupants who seemed to have established a brutal but stable society among the casinos. The NCR leadership saw opportunity, a major city that could become a regional hub, a destination that could attract settlers and generate wealth, a strategic position that would cement NCR control over the Mojave. But they also faced a problem. The tribes on the Strip were numerous, well-armed, and familiar with the territory. Simply taking Vegas by force would be costly, and the NCR military was already stretched thin by other expansion efforts. They needed another approach, some way to gain access to Vegas and the dam without a prolonged campaign. That's when House made his move. In 2027-40, he finally revealed himself, making contact with NCR leadership through careful intermediaries. He proposed a deal, a treaty that would give both sides what they needed. The NCR could have Hoover Dam and McCarran Airport for military operations, along with the electricity the dam would provide. In exchange, House would retain control of the Strip itself, maintaining it as an independent city-state that would cater to NCR tourists and provide services that the more moralistic Republic couldn't officially endorse. The New Vegas Treaty was complex, full of clauses about power distribution, water rights, military access, and economic arrangements. But the core was simple. The NCR got the dam and recognized House's authority over the Strip. House got legitimacy, protection from NCR annexation, and access to the flood of tourists and money that would come from NCR citizens looking for entertainment. It was, from House's perspective, a masterstroke. He was trading something he didn't control, Hoover Dam, which the NCR would have taken anyway, for recognition of his authority over the Strip, which he did control through his Securitrons. The NCR, for their part, thought they were getting the better deal. Let the mysterious Mr. House run his casinos. The dam was what mattered, and they had that. Both sides were partially right and partially wrong, which made it a fair negotiation. But House had one advantage. He had been planning this for over a century, while the NCR was figuring things out year by year. He knew exactly what he wanted and how to use the treaty to get it. The NCR knew what they needed immediately, but hadn't fully calculated what they were giving up long term. With the treaty signed, House moved to the next phase of his plan, pacifying the Strip. The raider tribes that occupied his casinos had been useful in preventing others from claiming Vegas, but they were also anarchic, violent, and completely unsuited to running the kind of establishment House envisioned. They would have to go, not all of them, but all their independence, all their freedom to act without House's approval. House had studied these tribes for decades through his surveillance network. He knew their leadership, their power structures, their strengths and weaknesses. He knew which ones could be reformed and which would have to be destroyed. And when he finally deployed his Securitrons from the Lucky 38, rolling out of storage for the first time since before the war, he knew exactly how to use them. The tribes were shocked. They had thought the Lucky 38 was empty or haunted, just another ruin on the Strip. Instead, it disgorged an army of robots under the command of someone who spoke through screens and speakers, who knew everything about them, who offered them a choice: leave the Strip, serve him, or die. Most tribes chose to leave, recognizing that they couldn't fight an enemy they didn't understand with resources they couldn't match. House let them go, even provided supplies for their departure. He wanted them gone, not martyred. A few tribes tried to fight and were annihilated by Securitron firepower. House left their bodies where they fell as an example. But 3 tribes were offered something different. House had studied them carefully and concluded they could be reformed, reshaped, turned into something useful. He didn't just offer them the choice to leave or die. He offered them the chance to stay, to prosper, to become wealthy and powerful beyond anything they had known as wasteland raiders. All they had to do was accept his absolute authority and transform themselves into the image he presented to them. The first tribe was shown pre-war recordings of the Rat Pack, of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, of the smooth entertainment culture that had defined old Vegas. They were given the Tops Casino and told to become the chairman, entertainers, hosts, the public face of New Vegas glamour. Their leader, Benny, was smart enough to see the opportunity and disciplined enough to enforce House's vision on his people. The second tribe was more problematic, violent, brutal, comfortable with the nastiest aspects of wasteland life. House gave them Gomorrah and told them to become the Omertas, running prostitution, drugs, and the darker entertainments that tourists wanted but wouldn't admit to wanting. House knew these activities would happen anyway. Better to have them controlled and taxed than operating independently. The third tribe had developed strange customs during their time on the Strip, including cannibalism during desperate times. House gave them the ultra-luxe and created the White Glove Society, telling them to become the height of class and sophistication. He demanded they abandon their cannibalistic practices and embrace pre-war notions of fine dining and elegant service. They did, though whether all members truly left the old ways behind remained questionable. These three families, as they became known, were House's proxies. They ran the casinos, provided services, maintained order on the Strip. But they did so under House's absolute control, enforced by Securitrons that patrolled constantly, and by the knowledge that House watched everything through his surveillance network. The families could prosper, but only on House's terms. They could become wealthy, but their wealth existed at his pleasure. And they did prosper. House reopened the Strip as New Vegas in the mid-2070s, advertising it across the Mojave and into NCR territory as a destination for gambling, entertainment, and freedom from the Republic's stricter laws. NCR citizens came in droves, bringing money that flowed through the casinos and into House's accounts. The families became rich running their establishments, and House, taking his cut of everything, accumulated wealth that translated into power. But House wasn't running New Vegas as a vanity project or simply to make money. Everything he did served a larger purpose, preparing for what he knew was coming. Because House's calculations showed that the Mojave was about to become a battleground, and New Vegas was positioned at its center. While House consolidated his control over the Strip, the NCR was making good on the treaty. Engineers and construction crews arrived at Hoover Dam in force, beginning the massive project of restoration. The dam had survived the war, but 2 centuries of neglect had taken their toll. Systems needed repair or replacement. Debris had to be cleared. The generators had to be brought back online. It was a monumental undertaking, but the NCR had the resources and expertise. They poured people and equipment into the project, establishing a permanent military presence at the dam and the surrounding area. Camp McCarran, the old pre-war airport, became a major NCR base, housing troops and equipment for the Mojave campaign. The work took years, but gradually, Hoover Dam came back to life. turbines that hadn't spun since before the Great War began turning again. Electricity flowed from the dam's generators into power lines that NCR engineers had restored, bringing light to forward operating bases and NCR settlements throughout the region. It was a triumph of engineering and a symbol of the Republic's capabilities, proof that they could restore pre-war infrastructure and use it to improve life for their citizens. But the dam's reactivation had consequences beyond providing power. Hoover Dam controlled the Colorado River, and the Colorado River was the Mojave's most valuable resource. Whoever held the dam controlled water distribution throughout the region, which meant controlling agriculture, controlling settlements, controlling life itself in the desert wasteland. The NCR had secured western access to the dam and begun establishing control over the river. But to the east, across the Colorado, another power was rising, one that viewed the dam not as an engineering achievement, but as a strategic objective that had to be taken by force. Caesar's legion had emerged from the chaos of the eastern wasteland, something the post-war world had never seen. A slave empire organized along Roman lines, brutal and efficient, expanding through conquest and assimilation. Caesar, born Edward Sallow, a former follower of the apocalypse-turned-warlord, had created a society that rejected everything about the pre-war world and most of the post-war attempts at civilization. No technology beyond the basics, no mercy for enemies, no tolerance for weakness. The Legion expanded through Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, conquering tribes and absorbing them into their army. They enslaved populations, crucified resistors, and created a terror state held together by Caesar's charisma, military success, and ruthless enforcement of discipline. By the 2070s, they had become one of the most powerful factions in the wasteland, controlling territory that rivaled the NCR. Caesar's strategy was simple: expand westward, take Hoover Dam, use it as a base to invade California and destroy the NCR. The dam represented everything strategically valuable: power, water, a crossing point over the Colorado, and a gateway to the west. Taking it would cripple NCR operations in the Mojave and provide the Legion with resources to sustain a prolonged campaign into California. The NCR military knew the Legion was coming. They had fought skirmishes with Legion scouts and raiding parties, had interrogated prisoners, and learned about the army being assembled to the east. They fortified their positions at the dam, brought in additional troops, and prepared for what they knew would be a major battle. In 2277, 4 years after the NCR had signed the treaty with House, and 3 years after they had secured Hoover Dam, Caesar's Legion launched their assault. The first Battle of Hoover Dam would become legendary in Mojave history, a clash that defined the region's future and set the stage for everything that followed. The Legion's strategy was characteristically brutal and direct. They came across the Colorado in force, led by Legate Joshua Graham, Caesar's most capable military commander and one of the Legion's founders. Graham was a brilliant tactician who understood how to use the Legion's strengths: their discipline, their willingness to accept casualties, their skill in close combat, to overcome NCR advantages in equipment and defensive positions. The battle was massive and bloody. Legion forces threw themselves at NCR positions with suicidal courage, accepting horrific casualties to close with defenders who had superior firepower. NCR troops fought desperately, knowing that defeat meant enslavement or crucifixion. The fighting raged across the dam itself, along the approaches in the surrounding hills and valleys. House watched from the Lucky 38, analyzing the battle through his surveillance network. He had no direct stake in the outcome. The treaty protected New Vegas regardless of who won. But he understood that the victor would shape the Mojave's future and his own options for expansion. He studied Legion tactics, assessed NCR capabilities, and calculated probabilities. The battle reached its climax on the dam itself, where Legion forces managed to reach the NCR defensive positions and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. The Legion's discipline and ferocity was matched by NCR determination and firepower. Casualties mounted on both sides. But the NCR held. Through superior tactics, better defensive positions, and ultimately greater resources, they broke the Legion assault. Legion forces, having exhausted themselves in repeated attacks, finally retreated back across the Colorado, leaving hundreds of bodies on the dam and the approaches. The first Battle of Hoover Dam was an NCR victory, decisive enough to halt Legion expansion, but not decisive enough to destroy them as a threat. The Legion had been driven back, but they remained intact as an organized force, still dangerous, still capable of threatening NCR positions. It was a stalemate disguised as a victory. The NCR had held the dam, but at tremendous cost, and everyone knew the Legion would try again. Caesar's response to the defeat was characteristically ruthless. Legate Joshua Graham had failed, and Caesar did not tolerate failure. In front of the assembled Legion army, Caesar ordered Graham covered in pitch, set on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. It was intended as execution, punishment for losing the battle, and a lesson to others about the cost of failing Caesar. But Graham survived. Horribly burned, scarred beyond recognition, he somehow crawled out of the canyon and disappeared into the wasteland. He would become known as the Burned Man, a legend whispered about in Legion territory and beyond. The legate who had been executed but lived, the monster in the wastes, the embodiment of judgment and survival. Graham's fall and survival became mythologized across the Mojave. Some said he was dead despite the rumors. Others claimed he had become something inhuman, kept alive by rage and divine purpose. The truth, as with many wasteland legends, was more complicated and less supernatural, but the myth served a purpose. It reminded everyone of Caesar's brutality and the Legion's fearsome discipline. With Graham gone, Caesar appointed a new legate and began rebuilding his forces for another attempt. The Legion withdrew to Fortification Hill, a position across the Colorado from the dam, and began a deliberate, patient preparation for the second battle. They gathered supplies, trained reinforcements, studied NCR defenses, and waited for the moment when they could attack with overwhelming force. The NCR, exhausted by the first battle, struggled to maintain their defensive posture. They had won, but the victory had revealed their limitations. Their supply lines were overextended. Their troops were spread thin across the Mojave. They lacked sufficient reinforcements to both hold existing positions and prepare for another Legion assault. The Republic had committed to the Mojave campaign, but that commitment was straining their military capabilities to the breaking point. And in New Vegas, House observed this developing stalemate and made his calculations. Both sides were weakening each other, neither capable of decisive victory. The NCR was too stretched to annex New Vegas forcibly. The Legion was too focused on the dam to threaten the Strip. House's position, protected by treaty and defended by Securitrons, remained secure. But House knew this balance couldn't last. Eventually, one side would gain an advantage, or some external factor would tip the scales. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam was inevitable, and its outcome would determine whether New Vegas remained independent or became absorbed into someone else's empire. House needed an edge, some advantage that would ensure his independence regardless of who won at the dam. He needed the Platinum Chip, the upgrade that would transform his Securitrons into a military force capable of deterring both the NCR and the Legion. Without it, he was vulnerable to whoever emerged victorious from the dam. With it, he could guarantee New Vegas's independence and begin expanding his own influence. So House intensified his search for the chip, deployed more resources to tracking it, pushed his information networks to find any trace of the lost device. And finally, after decades of searching, he found it. The Platinum Chip had ended up in the possession of a merchant in the Wasteland, someone who didn't know what they had, who thought it was just another pre-war curiosity. House arranged through intermediaries to purchase it, contracted with Mojave Express to deliver it to the Lucky 38, and waited for the delivery that would change everything. The courier carrying the chip left California, heading east toward New Vegas, carrying in their satchel the key to House's ultimate victory. House tracked their progress, monitored their route, calculated arrival times. In a matter of days, he would have the chip. In a matter of weeks, his Securitrons would be upgraded. And then, when the Second Battle of Hoover Dam came, House would be ready to ensure that New Vegas remained his, regardless of what happened at the dam. But the best-laid plans of men and machines don't always account for human variables, for the chaos that individuals can introduce into even the most carefully calculated scenarios. Because someone else had learned about the Platinum Chip, someone with their own agenda, someone willing to kill a courier and steal the chip for purposes that had nothing to do with House's grand designs. The courier never made it to New Vegas, and that single act of violence would set in motion events that would determine the future of the Mojave, of New Vegas, and of Robert House's 2-century-long plan to reshape civilization according to his vision. The year 2281 began like any other in the Mojave, with tension, with preparation for a war everyone knew was coming, with the various factions maneuvering for advantage. The NCR fortified their positions at Hoover Dam. The Legion gathered strength at Fortification Hill, and in New Vegas, House refined his plans and waited for the Platinum Chip that would give him the power to control his own destiny. The courier contracted to deliver the chip was unremarkable by Wasteland standards, competent, reliable, experienced enough to handle the dangerous route from California to Nevada. Mojave Express had a good reputation, and their couriers were generally successful at getting packages through raider territory and past the various hazards of wasteland travel. This courier's assignment seemed straightforward: deliver a sealed package to the Lucky 38 in New Vegas. The pay was generous, reflecting the package's importance to the client, but nothing about the job seemed particularly unusual. Just another delivery run across the Mojave, the kind of work couriers did regularly. What the courier didn't know was that information about the Platinum Chip had leaked. Benny, the leader of the chairman and manager of the Tops Casino, had learned through his intelligence network that House was having something valuable delivered. Benny was ambitious, restless under House's control, and increasingly convinced that he could take over New Vegas if he could somehow neutralize House's Securitron advantage. The platinum chip represented opportunity. Benny didn't know exactly what it did, but he knew House wanted it desperately, which meant it was valuable. If Benny could intercept it, study it, potentially use it himself, maybe he could free himself and the other families from House's control. Maybe he could become the ruler of New Vegas, rather than just House's employee. So Benny arranged an ambush. He took several of his most trusted chairmen to Goodsprings, a small settlement north of New Vegas where the courier's route passed. They waited at the town cemetery in the dark until the courier arrived. And then, with methodical efficiency, they shot the courier, took the platinum chip from their body, and buried them in a shallow grave. It should have been murder. By all reasonable calculations, the courier should have died. But the Wasteland has a way of defying reasonable calculations, of producing survivors from situations that should be fatal. The courier lived, barely, critically injured, but alive. And a man named Victor, a Securitron that had been monitoring the area on House's orders, intervened. Victor dug up the courier and brought them to Doc Mitchell in Goodsprings, where the doctor performed emergency surgery that saved their life. When the courier woke up days later, scarred by a bullet wound to the head, but alive and functional, they had no reason to know how important they had become. They knew only that someone named Benny had shot them, stolen their package, and left them for dead. Most people in that situation would have cut their losses, gotten as far from the Mojave as possible. But this courier was different. Whether through stubbornness, professional pride, or simple desire for revenge, they decided to track down Benny and recover what had been stolen. That decision, that choice to pursue rather than flee, would change everything. Because in seeking Benny, the courier would be pulled into the convergence of forces that was building around New Vegas and Hoover Dam. They would become not just a participant, but a pivot point, someone whose choices would ultimately determine which faction controlled the Mojave's future. House learned of the courier's survival through Victor and his other surveillance assets. His initial reaction might have been to simply have the courier killed as a loose end, or to have the Securitron recover the chip by force. But House saw opportunity. This courier had survived execution, had proven resilient and determined. Such individuals were rare and potentially useful. If House could recruit the courier, use them as an agent in ways that his Securitrons couldn't accomplish, they might solve problems that House's direct force couldn't address. So House waited, watched, and prepared to make his proposal when the courier reached New Vegas. He would offer employment, resources, and answers about what had happened and why. In exchange, the courier would recover the platinum chip and serve House's interests in the coming conflict. It was transactional, pragmatic, the kind of arrangement House preferred. Clear expectations, mutual benefit, enforceable through the leverage House held. The courier's journey from Goodsprings to New Vegas took them through the Mojave Wasteland at its most varied and dangerous. They passed through settlements like Prim and Nipton, each with their own stories of survival and compromise. They encountered NCR patrols struggling to maintain order across too much territory. They saw evidence of Legion atrocities, the crucifixions and enslavement that marked Caesar's approach to conquest. And they learned about the Mojave's factions, its power structures, its conflicts. The NCR, stretched thin, but determined to hold the dam and expand their influence. The Legion, brutal but disciplined, waiting for their moment to strike. The various independent settlements trying to survive between the two powers. The Brotherhood of Steel, isolated in their bunker, obsessed with technology and their own survival. The Boomers at Nellis Air Force Base, xenophobic but possessing pre-war weapons that made them dangerous. The Great Khans, raiders with a grudge against the NCR. And New Vegas itself, glittering in the desert, promising wealth and entertainment while hiding the control systems that kept it running. Each faction the courier encountered wanted something, needed something, hoped to use the courier for their own purposes. And as the courier moved through the wasteland, they began to understand that they were walking into something far larger than a simple package delivery gone wrong. The platinum chip was important, yes, but it was important because of what it represented. A shift in the balance of power that could determine the Mojave's future. When the courier finally reached New Vegas and confronted Benny at the tops, they learned the full scope of what they had been carrying. Benny had been trying to understand the chip, to use it, but he lacked the access codes and technical knowledge. He had the key but didn't know which lock it opened or what door it would unlock. The confrontation between Benny and the courier could go multiple ways. Violence, negotiation, seduction, manipulation. But ultimately, the courier recovered the chip. And then House revealed himself, invited the courier to the Lucky 38 and made his proposal. He explained what the chip did, how it would upgrade the Securitron army, why it was crucial to maintaining New Vegas's independence. He explained his vision for the future, his plan to use New Vegas as a base for eventually rebuilding civilization along more rational, autocratic lines. And he offered the courier employment, deliver the chip to the upgrade facilities, assist with preparation for the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, and help House secure control over the Mojave's future. The courier could accept, becoming House's agent and champion. They could refuse and seek other allegiances. The NCR offered citizenship and support for expanding the Republic. The Legion offered less appealing incentives but represented another path to power. Various independent factions offered their own deals. Or the courier could chart an independent course, using the chip and their growing influence to claim New Vegas for themselves, with the help of Yes Man, a Securitron programmed to assist Benny, but now bound to serve whoever held him. This was the moment when the Mojave's future pivoted on individual choice. 3 major factions, House, the NCR, and the Legion, all wanted the courier's support. Multiple minor factions hoped to influence the outcome. And the courier, a person who had been shot and left for dead weeks earlier, suddenly held leverage that could tip the balance. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam was approaching. NCR scouts reported Legion forces massing at Fortification Hill. Legion spies indicated NCR preparing defensive positions. Both sides were ready, waiting only for the moment when Caesar decided to launch his assault. And New Vegas, with its upgraded Securitrons, or without them, with House in control or deposed, with the courier as ally or enemy, would be crucial to determining who won that battle and who would control the Mojave afterward. The beauty of the Mojave's story is that it doesn't have a single ending. Unlike other chapters in Wasteland history where outcomes are fixed, where we know who won and who lost, the Second Battle of Hoover Dam remains open-ended. The official canon deliberately avoids specifying which faction prevailed, which path the Courier chose, which vision for the Mojave's future became reality. This ambiguity isn't a weakness, it's a strength. It acknowledges that the wasteland is shaped by individuals making choices, that power doesn't always flow predictably, that even the best-laid plans can be disrupted by the decisions of a single person who refuses to follow the script others wrote for them. Let us consider the possibilities, the different futures that could emerge from the convergence of 2,281, each valid, each representing one answer to the questions the Mojave raised about power, authority, and what it means to rebuild civilization. House's victory would represent autocracy's triumph, the rule of one brilliant mind that had planned for this moment since before the Great War. If the Courier sided with House, delivered the platinum chip, and helped secure his position, New Vegas would become something unique in the wasteland. A city-state run by effective immortal intelligence, enforcing order through superior technology, accumulating wealth and power to eventually spread House's vision beyond the Mojave. House would argue this is the best outcome. He would point to his track record. He saved Las Vegas from nuclear destruction, maintained the city through centuries of chaos, created stability and prosperity where others found only violence. His vision is long-term, calculated to benefit humanity over decades and centuries, rather than offering immediate gains that might compromise future success. He has no corruption because he has no physical needs. He has no succession crisis because he doesn't age or die. He represents progress, science, rationality over the tribal warfare, and ideological conflicts that plague other factions. Critics would note that House's vision is fundamentally autocratic, that it offers no voice to the people it governs, that it reduces humans to economic units whose purpose is generating wealth and following orders. House claims to work for humanity's benefit, but he has also proven willing to destroy anyone who opposes him, to manipulate and control without consent. His immortality isn't a feature, it's a trap, ensuring that his particular vision, his specific biases and limitations will shape society forever without possibility of reform or evolution. NCR victory would represent democracy's expansion, the triumph of the Republic's attempt to restore pre-war governmental structures and values. If the Courier sided with the NCR, helped them secure Hoover Dam and drive back the Legion, the Mojave would be absorbed into the Republic, bringing the rule of law, elections, and federal governance to the region. The NCR would argue this is the morally correct outcome. They offer citizenship, rights, democratic participation in government. They oppose slavery, protect civilians, attempt to establish justice through law rather than force. They're imperfect, certainly, bureaucratic, sometimes corrupt, stretched thin by overexpansion. But they're trying to rebuild something worth having, a society where people have say in their governance and recourse against injustice. They represent the best hope for eventually restoring something resembling pre-war civilization without repeating its worst mistakes. Critics would note that the NCR's reach exceeds their grasp, that they're expanding faster than they can effectively govern, that their promises of protection often ring hollow to settlements too distant from supply lines and reinforcements. Their democracy is real, but also corrupted by wealthy interests and political maneuvering. Their presence in the Mojave is partly idealistic, but also driven by resource extraction and economic exploitation. They claim to bring civilization, but they also bring taxation, conscription, and federal authority that overrides local autonomy. Legion victory would represent Caesar's vision, a brutal rejection of both pre-war and post-war attempts at civilization in favor of something built on Roman models and held together by fear, discipline, and personality cult. If the courier sided with the Legion, helped them take Hoover Dam and defeat the NCR, the Mojave would become Caesar's base for eventual invasion of California. The Legion would argue, or rather, Caesar would argue, as the Legion doesn't really do debate, that their system works. They've united dozens of tribes into a functioning military state. They've eliminated raiding, established safe roads, created stability through harsh but predictable laws. In Legion territory, traders can travel without fear of bandit attack because bandits are crucified. Women and children are protected because anyone who harms them faces execution. Yes, the Legion practices slavery and rules through terror, but they've brought order to lands that knew only chaos. Critics would note that the Legion's order is built on atrocity, that their stability requires constant conquest and oppression, that their society treats most humans as property without rights or agency. Caesar claims to be building something sustainable, but his empire is held together by his personal charisma and ruthlessness. What happens when he dies? The Legion has no clear succession mechanism, no institutions that can outlast its founder. It's a slaver empire disguised as civilization, and its victory would represent the worst outcome for everyone except Caesar's inner circle. Independent victory would represent rejection of all external authority, the courier using House's systems without House, claiming New Vegas for themselves, and establishing something. What exactly depends on the courier's choices, their alliances, their vision. An independent New Vegas could become a genuinely free city-state, a chaotic no-man's land, an enlightened republic, or a new autocracy replacing House with someone who might be better or worse. The courier, if they chose this path, could argue that they're giving the Mojave something it hasn't had, the chance to determine its own future without outside powers imposing their visions. House is brilliant but dictatorial. The NCR is democratic but imperialistic. The Legion is monstrous. An independent New Vegas, freed from all three, could be whatever its people make it. For better or worse, at least it would be theirs. Critics would note that independence without planning is just chaos, that the courier's rejection of authority doesn't automatically create something better, that individual rule by someone who shot their way to power isn't obviously superior to the alternatives. The independent path is defined more by what it opposes than what it supports, and that makes it uncertain, risky, potentially catastrophic if the courier lacks the wisdom and capability to maintain what they've taken. These possibilities remain unresolved. The Mojave's future is deliberately left open, allowing each observer to imagine which outcome occurred, which vision prevailed, which faction's gamble paid off. Perhaps that's appropriate. The Wasteland has never offered clear answers or unambiguous victories. It offers only choices, consequences, and the ongoing struggle of survivors trying to build something worth preserving from the ashes of the old world. What we know for certain is that Robert House's story is remarkable regardless of its ending. a man born in 2020 who predicted the apocalypse, survived it through technological brilliance and careful planning, waited centuries for his opportunity, and came within reach of controlling the Mojave's future. Whether he succeeded or failed, whether he remained in power or was destroyed, whether his vision was vindicated or rejected, his mere existence was an achievement unmatched in the post-war world. House proved that one individual, given sufficient intelligence, resources, and determination, could survive the end of civilization and remain a force centuries later. He demonstrated that technology and planning could trump military might and popular support. He showed that the pre-war world's achievements, Vegas's survival, the Lucky 38 systems, the Securitron army, could remain relevant and powerful in the post-war wasteland. But he also demonstrated the limitations of pure rationality and autocratic control. House could calculate probabilities, but he couldn't predict individual choices. He could plan for centuries, but he couldn't account for a courier who refused to stay dead and then refused to follow anyone's script. He could control robots and systems, but he couldn't control human nature, which persisted in being unpredictable, stubborn, and willing to choose freedom over security. New Vegas itself, regardless of who ruled it after 2281, represented something important in wasteland history. Proof that cities could survive, that complexity could be rebuilt, that the post-war world didn't have to remain locked in tribal warfare and subsistence survival. The Strip's neon lights, whether powered by House's vision, NCR's generators, or some independent arrangement, showed that civilization could return, that humanity hadn't lost the capacity to create things beyond simple survival. The casinos stood as monuments to both the old world's excesses and the new world's possibilities. They had been built on greed and fantasy, but they now served as shelter and centers of economic activity. They represented continuity between pre-war and post-war, showing that not everything from the old world deserved to be forgotten, that some achievements were worth preserving and building upon. And the Mojave itself, for all its dangers and conflicts, had become one of the wasteland's most developed regions. Trade routes connected settlements. Hoover Dam provided power. Water flowed from the Colorado. Factions competed and cooperated in complex arrangements that resembled politics more than simple tribal warfare. It wasn't paradise, but it was progress. Humanity relearning how to build societies, how to govern, how to create something more than mere survival. The house might always win, as the old casino motto promised. But in the wasteland, even winning isn't permanent, isn't guaranteed, isn't always what you expected when you placed your bet. Robert House wagered everything on his vision, his calculations, his ability to control variables across centuries. Whether he won that bet depended on choices made by people he couldn't fully predict or control. And perhaps that's the real lesson of New Vegas, that no plan survives contact with human unpredictability, that control is always partial and temporary, that the future belongs not to whoever calculates best, but to whoever adapts most successfully to the chaos that calculations can't fully capture. The Mojave Wasteland would continue, regardless of who won the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. New Vegas would endure, its lights still shining in the desert, its casinos still drawing visitors seeking fortune and escape. The Colorado River would still flow, Hoover Dam would still generate power, and survivors would still struggle to build lives worth living in a world that had tried to end but somehow persisted. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to accept endings, defines the wasteland. Civilization ended, but humans continued. The old world died, but people built new ones. Robert House tried to control the future, but the future, characteristically, refused to be controlled completely. The house always wins, they say. But in New Vegas, in the Mojave, in the wasteland itself, the game never really ends. It just moves to the next hand, the next bet, the next chance to win or lose everything. And as long as the game continues, as long as people keep betting on impossible survival and occasionally succeeding, there's hope that eventually someone will build something worth having from the ruins of everything that was lost. The neon lights of New Vegas shine in the darkness, a beacon of what was and what might be again. And whether that future is bright or dark, ordered or chaotic, controlled or free, it will be written by the choices of survivors who refuse to let the wasteland have the final word. The house always wins, but the wasteland always continues. And in that continuation, in that ongoing struggle, lies whatever hope the post-war world can offer.